when I first became a member of the SWP some years ago, one of the things that my school friends at the time, because I was quite young, kept pointing out to me was that the great majority of these working class people who you talk about all the time are neither revolutionaries nor socialists. What do you mean you want to lead a proletarian revolution? This is complete nonsense. These people aren't revolutionaries, they're certainly not socialists. What are you talking about? This, they very confidently pointed out, showed it was ludicrous for me to be involved in an organisation like the SWP. Now, there's a very common right-wing version of this idea that essentially says that working class people will always be as they are now. That, of course, it's true that the great majority of working class people in Britain and any other country you choose, with the possible exception of Egypt today, the majority are not revolutionary, and in the case of Britain, only a small minority of people are revolutionaries or socialists. There's also, although it's less common, a left-wing version of this myth, and the myth goes something like this, that really working class people are always revolutionary, always militant, always socialist, and there's a thin layer at the top, Miliband, Len McCluskey, holding them back, but really people are chomping at the bit. And both are, of course, completely one-sided myths. What Marxism gives us, I think, is a much more dynamic understanding of class and how people's ideas change in society. And Marx, when he was very, very young, in 1843, put it extremely well. He wrote, "The question is not what this or that worker, or even the whole working class at the moment, considers as its aim. The question is what the working class is, and what consequently of that being it will be compelled to do." Very, very important quote in the history of Marxism, because what Marx is saying is that, of course, at any given moment, this or that worker may not be a revolutionary. Nonetheless, there are historic pressures on workers brought about by the capitalist system itself. The very position of workers in society, one of exploitation, and would have been drawn together in workplaces and cities and so on, compels workers to fight again and again. And that's the point Marx is making. It's a historical pressure. It doesn't mean that every worker will be revolutionary all the time. Ideas change in a process. And because of the position of workers in society, which we discussed in the previous two meetings in this course, working class people have struggled more persistently than any other oppressed class in world history. Of course, you have slave rebellions in ancient Rome, Spartacus is uprising in ancient Rome, and so on. You have peasant rebellions, and so on and so forth, every few decades, every few centuries. The working class, if you look at the 20th century, it's a history of working class struggles. Every decade you can find a revolution somewhere, you can find mass struggles, strikes, resistance of some kind or another. Very important to remind ourselves of that, because often we fixate on the low level of struggle in Britain. If you take the broad historical picture, the working class people have been more militant than any oppressed group in any previous form of society. And that process means that again and again people's expectations clash with the realities of the system, and you begin to get struggles developing. Struggles tend to come in quite big waves. If you take the wave of revolutions that came after the First World War, the struggles from 1968 through to the 1970s, these are quite big waves of struggle. Let me just say by way of introduction that I think the reason why this question is so vitally important today is I think we're at the beginning of a new wave of global struggles. Be very careful in how we assess it, but if you look at what's happening in the Arab world, if you look at what's happening in some areas of Europe, such as Greece, and if you look at what's now beginning to take place in Brazil and Turkey, what you're seeing on a global scale is people's expectations clashing with the reality of the system, and struggles begin to erupt on a quite impressive scale. And we hope this will lead to a new cycle of struggles on a global scale. Okay, so why is it that most of the time most workers accept ideas that run contrary to their interests? Because most of the ideas people accept, there'll always be a capitalist presiding over you, parliamentary democracy is the best system we can have, maybe even worse ideas like racism and sexism and so on. These are not in the interests of working class people, these kind of ideas. In fact, they run contrary to the interests of working class people. Why do people accept these ideas for long periods of time, and how can they change? And the best way of explaining this, I think, was set out by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And the way Gramsci put it was this. He said that workers don't have a single fixed set of ideas. Workers have what he called a contradictory consciousness, a contradictory set of ideas in their heads at any one time. And he says there's a first set of ideas that we uncritically absorb from society, that are the ideas predominantly of the ruling class, sexism, racism, deference to the boss and so on, that for long periods of time people uncritically accept. And the reason why we accept them is not because of stupidity. This is something you often get if you become a revolutionary. You suddenly turn around and say, everyone must be really stupid to accept these ideas. And you remember, a few weeks ago I accepted those ideas. It's not because of stupidity, it's because of the position that people find themselves in society. We go for a school system that disciplines us, we're thrown onto the labour market, and in the labour market we're atomised, we're forced to work in conditions not of our own choosing, we feel powerless, we feel divided from any control over society, we're told that the only options we have are what we consume, maybe which bourgeois politician you vote for and so on, we feel powerless. The market presents itself to us as a sort of natural phenomena. People talk about bond markets ruling our lives. These become impersonal forces that are almost like an act of nature shaping the world around us. And under those conditions, what Marx referred to as alienation, in which we're separated from any control over our lives, under those conditions we can feel powerless and feel like we can simply, the best we can do is look after ourselves, our family, and so on. And under those conditions, people can accept all kinds of ideas that run contrary to their interests. So Gramsci says, there's a contradictory consciousness. Those uncritically accepted ideas is one side of it. But there's always another side to it. And the other side to it is a conception of the world that Gramsci says is produced by our collective relationships with people around us. Our sense of working together alongside other people. The sense of struggle and solidarity we get from when we fight back. Even perhaps a memory from what our parents told us about when they fought back, or our friends told us, or it's about being in work and it's a time we got one over on the boss and we got an extra 5 minutes on our toilet breaks, or whatever it is, some basic idea of struggle and solidarity that almost every working class person must have experienced at some point in their life. Gramsci's argument is that these two different conceptions of the world, one pointing to the future, one derived from the past, coexist in people's heads in a contradictory mixture. And the contradictory mixture is important because for long periods of time that can breed a degree of passivity. People can be torn between the contradictions and they can feel powerless and not act. But at the same time, because it's contradictory, it can suddenly flip over into militancy. When people talk about people being apathetic, it doesn't mean that they feel their lives are getting better. I mean, who at the moment feels our lives are getting better every year and our kids are going to have a brighter future and everything's going to be rosy? Very few people feel that way. People feel intensely bitter about society, but they don't necessarily feel powerful enough to act. But in those circumstances, with the contradictions in people's heads, that situation can very rapidly flip around from passivity into activism, militancy and struggle. It's a dynamic picture of how ideas change. The contradictions lead people much of the time to look to not the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system, but to look to ways in which they can transform it in much more moderate ways, what we call reformism. The piecemeal reform of the system, for many people much of the time, seems like a fairly sensible goal. Even actually when people start moving into revolution, they often do so under the slogan of reform. You look at the slogan of the Great Indonesian Revolution of 97-98, people were demonstrating with placards that said, we want reform, we want reform. In Egypt today, people talk about reform even as they're making revolution. People talk about it as a reformist struggle. Now, reformism isn't just an idea people have in their heads, it also takes roots in organisational forms. Out of this reformist consciousness crystallise organisations inside the working class, and it develops an organised expression. If you think about the two key elements of this in Britain, one of them is the trade union bureaucracy. The trade union bureaucracy exist in the trade unions to preside over the exploitation of workers, to negotiate the terms under which workers are exploited. The emergence of trade unions is an enormous step forwards because it's a basic form of organisation of working class people, collective forms of organisation. As Frederick Engels put it, the trade unions are schools of struggle, but it's contradictory because the people presiding over the trade union organisations, the trade union bureaucracy, see their role as negotiating the terms of exploitation under capitalism. And it means at critical points, the trade union bureaucracy can act to hold back the struggle as well as promoting struggles. It plays a contradictory role. Secondly, if you look at organisations such as the Labour Party, these are organisations that reflect reformist consciousness and say, we want change, but we want change within the context of the capitalist system. And even very radical organisations like Syriza in Greece, a radical left reformist organisation, can give people confidence, can inspire them, and so on, but also at critical moments says, yes, but we have to confine our struggles to the changes that we can realise within the Greek capitalist system, or within the Eurozone, without breaking the Eurozone, and so on. These institutions play a very contradictory role. Finally, it's important to say that the ruling class rule for a combination of different factors, a combination of force and fraud. The balance is different in different societies. You know, if you look at the level of repression in Tunisia or Egypt and so on, far, far higher level of repression than in Britain. In Britain, slightly more fraud and slightly less force, although they will use force in Britain if they're pushed to do so, and they have done in the past. But even in Egyptian society, they don't rule purely through force. If you look at what the army is doing at the moment in Egypt, they're trying to stabilise the position not through a military dictatorship, they're trying to put in place politicians who can contain the struggles so that the military down the line can re-establish order in Egypt. Always a combination of force and fraud is used to try and maintain control in these societies. Okay. How does this more or less stable situation begin to change? And here I think we have to reject one of the arguments that you hear very, very often on the left, which is that things have to get really, 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 really bad, and then we'll fight. This is nonsense. If that were the case, then sub-Saharan Africa would be where the most militant struggles happened. Actually, if you're beaten over the head, you don't always resist. Sometimes you just lie unconscious on the floor if you're beaten over the head. That's been my experience anyway. Being attacked can make you fight, but it's not automatic. It's not true things have to get really, really bad. It's much more about the clash between people's expectations of what the system will deliver and the reality of the system. And this contradiction comes to the fore particularly in moments of crisis. It can be a political crisis, a disastrous foreign war, or whatever. But the most obvious form for us today, I think, is economic crisis. Because what happens in economic crisis is that the old ideas that help to retain a degree of consent from those who are ruled over begin to break down. See, in 2007, the boss could probably turn to you and say, well, you know, it'll be a short crisis, a few months, and then you'll get your wage rise next year. After 5 years of crisis, it's increasingly difficult for the boss to turn around and say, well, you know, it's a short crisis, a couple of years' time, and it'll get better. Crisis, one of the impact of it is to begin to break down the hold of ruling class ideas, to put into question all of the ideas that many people took for granted, these uncritically accepted ideas that form one part of our consciousness begin to be challenged. Secondly, within this context, bits of the ruling class can fall out among one another. There are clashes at the top of society, politically, ideologically, economically, as the ruling class begin to fight with one another over who's going to pay the price for the crisis. Will it be the bankers? Will it be industry? Will it be this or that national set of capitalists that pay the price? Who's going to pay the price for the crisis? Where do we shift the burden? Marx writes about it very well when he says that when things are going well, the capitalists operate as a fraternity that exploit all of us. When things start going badly, it becomes a question not of pumping profits out of us, but who's going to get the profits and who's not, and they become a band of hostile brothers. And these cracks at the top of society begin to create a space in which other ideas begin to develop out. The cracks at the top are important because they give space for new ideas to develop. as new ideas develop, something else can happen too. What can begin to happen is that new forces and new ideas develop from below. It's not enough for the old ideas to begin to be called into question and break up. New ideas have to come to the fore. And new ideas come to the fore in particular when people begin to fight. And often in big struggles, the kind of struggles that lead to revolution, they begin not with, the SWP is not going to go on the street and wave a red flag and everyone's going to come out and demonstrate. It doesn't work like that. These struggles begin as mass, spontaneous eruptions of anger. How did the Arab Revolution start? A small trader by the side of the road in Tunisia gets beaten up by the cops, arrested and so on, sets fire to himself, kills himself. That's what sparks it off. But what that did was trigger years of a sense of inequality, bitterness, anger over the dictatorship, anger over food prices. This rage suddenly bursts out into a wave of spontaneous struggle. It begins spontaneously in the sense that nobody orders the people onto the streets, the people come out onto the streets because they're angry, and things suddenly turn into an explosion of struggle. As this begins to happen, you get all kinds of layers of people drawn into the struggle. I met some Indonesian revolutionaries in 1998 when they just made a revolution, and one of the things they said to me was, when we woke up that morning, we weren't revolutionaries. We didn't know we were revolutionaries. By the end of the day, they were burning down Parliament. Now, that's the transformation that happened in the revolution. People are pulled into struggle, and as they're pulled into struggle, their ideas begin to change. And you see that in many different ways. If you look at Egypt today, and you look at a society very, very deeply divided on religious lines, and you hear the stories in Tahrir Square of the Coptic Christians, a very oppressed group, surrounding the Muslims when it was their time for prayer, and the Muslims would surround the Coptic Christians when it was their time to pray in order to defend one another. As people begin to fight back, they recognise their common interests, and the barriers between black and white, women and men, gay and straight begin to break down and be challenged. And as this happens, every oppressed group in society begins to look to the revolution to liberate them. If you're a peasant, if you're a racially oppressed minority and so on, you can start to look to the revolution as a source of solidarity. And this further changes the ideas in people's heads. Revolution, though, is not something that happens in a day or even a week. Revolution is a process. And as the process unfolds, ideas begin to change more. It's not true that people's ideas flip over from reformist ideas to revolutionary ideas overnight. It's not true that everyone makes a revolution and then they all become members of the Socialist Workers' Party or revolutionary organisation. It's not that simple. Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, put it very well when he said that what happens is the gradual comprehension by a class of the problems arising from the social crisis. And it takes place, as he put it, through a method of successive approximation. In other words, the masses learn through their own experience of struggle, both their own power and the limitations of the reformist leaders they might previously have looked to. You see this process in Greece today. Workers who might previously have looked to PASOK, the equivalent of the Labour Party in Greece, once the biggest party in Greece, which now polls 3 or 4% in the opinion polls. Today, those workers, many of the workers are gravitating towards Syriza, a left-wing reformist party, much more radical than PASOK, but still a reformist organisation. The problem is that Syriza are now beginning to force through a number of measures holding back the struggle at critical moments, and workers are beginning to question their relationship with Syriza. You get this process in which workers learn through their experience of struggle and through this process of successive approximation and begin to look to more radical alternatives. Now, I want to turn to a very important question about the role of working class people in particular in these struggles. Why in particular are working class people critical to revolutions? The first and most obvious reason is that the great majority in almost any society you look at, whether it's Egypt or Britain, South Korea, or any society, any modern society you look at, if you don't win the working class, you ain't going to make a mass revolution. But there's something much more fundamental to that, which is that if you look at the way these struggles develop, the the working class can play a very particular and special role within them. The first and most obvious reason is, where does power lie in a capitalist society? Now, we know that the ruling class have enormous power concentrated in their hands, but if we want to confront that power, where do we find a source of working class power? We find it through our collective organisation inside the workplace. Why is that? There are many oppressed groups in society. I happen to be mixed race, so I suffer racial oppression. That's horrible, doesn't give me any particular power to suffer racial oppression. There isn't any power that comes to you for being racially discriminated against or suffering sexism or whatever. If you're working class, you're not simply oppressed, you're exploited. And exploitation is a process of pumping value, wealth out of those at the bottom of society and giving it to those at the top. And it means that exploitation gives you power. Marx describes it like this. He says that capital is a vampire living off the blood of living labour. Think about vampires, though. I don't know if there's any fans of vampire movies in this room. I want to put my hands up to that. The thing about vampires, though, as you know if you watch vampire movies, is when they're deprived of blood, they very rapidly die. And that form of oppression, exploitation in the workplace, gives us power because we create all the wealth in society, we do everything, we move everything, we're responsible for everything, and when we withhold that labour, we have power. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that working class people look to collective solutions. At the high points of struggle, their solutions are collective. And there's a reason for that. You see, if you look at the great peasant revolts that have taken place historically, peasant revolts take the form of peasants rising up, killing the landowners, taking the land, divide the land, and we all have our plot of land. That's what your aspiration is. If you're a peasant, we want our own land. We'll farm it ourselves with our families. If you're a worker, you can't do that. Let me give you a concrete example. The biggest workplace in Northern Europe, Heathrow Airport. 80,000 people work at Heathrow Airport. Now, if the workers at Heathrow Airport rise up, seize control of the airport, they can't divide it 80,000 ways, take a bit of it home, and each try and land a plane in their front garden. It doesn't work like that. The only solution in that situation is a collective solution where you take control of the means of production and run it collectively from below. And that's collective nature to working class struggle means at the high point of struggle, workers begin to create from the bottom upwards new democratic ways of running society. Again and again in the Great Revolutions, you begin to see these kind of bodies emerging. You see glimpses of it today, incidentally. Small, tiny glimpses, but in Greece, where workers took over a newspaper which has been closed down and began to run it under workers' control. They only produced a couple of issues, but it's a tiny glimpse of what workers' power looks like. The attempts to draw together trade unionists in Egypt and give them networks of collective working class strength gives a little glimpse of how society could be organised in a different way. But if you look at the 20th century, the high points in Russia in 1905, 1917, when workers formed what they called Soviets, workers' committees, this was in a far more expansive way, an example of workers collectively imposing a solution on society, democratically, from below, creating new organs in which workers can run society. And that's happened again and again. If you look at similar developments in 1918 in Germany, where workers formed workers and soldiers' councils, in Hungary in 1956, in Chile in 1973, in the great struggles that preceded the Pinochet coup, workers formed cordones, which were their form of workers' councils in Iran in 1979. You find these glimpses of collective organisation that can begin to point to a different way of running society. And that Soviet-type body, democratic bodies elected from below inside the workplace, is a key element of what we mean when we talk about socialist revolution. Lenin put it very well. He said that the Soviets in Russia are organs of direct mass struggle. They originate as organs of the strike movement. By force of circumstance, they rapidly become the organs of the general revolutionary struggle. So bodies that develop to lead the strike movement suddenly begin to link up with one another and begin to become a new ruling power in society. And what emerges from that is what Lenin calls a situation of dual power, where you have the old institutions on the one hand, Parliament, the police, the civil servants, the judiciary and so on, but you have a new power as well, created from below, far more democratic and based on working class struggles. But that situation of dual power is one that's deeply... deeply, deeply unstable. And the question that's posed in a revolutionary situation is, how does it end? See, I said before that every great revolution begins as a mass spontaneous struggle. I know of no revolution that's ended spontaneously. Revolutions end because one side or the other imposes itself over society. And the question in every revolution is, will our side have the cohesion, the organisation, the knowledge of previous struggles embodied in organisations? Will it have the tools it needs to draw together its struggles, confront the old ruling institutions, the state, and so on, and break through? Who's going to win in Egypt? Will it be the workers organised from below, or will it be the army coming back, and eventually, when they've stabilised the situation, potentially drowning the revolution in blood? Who's going to impose their will over that society? And this brings me to the final element, which is a critical part of this, the question of how work has become revolutionary. Because even a network of bodies created from below democratically to begin to preside over society is not sufficient. You need Soviet-type bodies, you need workers' councils, or whatever you call them in 2013. You need those bodies to run society anew, but you also need something else. Because when people move into struggle for the first time, they do so with enormous unevenness. It's a very uneven, chaotic process. You think about in Egypt, there are millions of people who learned the lessons of struggle in the first stage of the revolution. A couple of weeks ago, there were 17 million people on the streets. That means far, far vaster layers have come onto the streets since then, who haven't necessarily learned, internalised the lessons of the previous phase of struggle. They don't know not to trust the army. They don't really know the ins and outs of what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood and why you can't trust these political leaders. They haven't learned those lessons yet. The question is, out of those first stages in the revolution, was there an organisation formed, a revolutionary party of significant size and weight within that struggle that can learn those lessons and bring those lessons to bear on the next phase of struggle? Is there a party? Trotsky once said of the party is the memory of the class. It's not an abstract thing. It means we learn from centuries of workers' struggles, we learn the lessons and we seek to apply them concretely in the here and now. Is there an organisation which had learned the lessons of history and can try and apply them today to draw together the struggles and direct them against the ruling class? Is there a revolutionary party at the centre of that revolutionary process? And I suppose the final point I want to make is that I think if you look at the history of the 20th century, the history of the 20th century is a history of people who have fought heroically, who have given their lives, who have seen their bodies and minds broken by the ruling class in the course of trying to make a revolution. The reality is that almost every single revolutionary struggle has been defeated. And the major reason why they've been defeated is that in a revolution you cannot improvise organisation. Talk to the revolutionary socialists of Egypt and they will tell you that when the revolution breaks out, it's far too late to begin the process of building a revolutionary party. And thank God there are people in Egypt who began years ago trying to forge a revolutionary organisation in very, very difficult circumstances. We have to say today, for all that people get annoyed about the level of struggle and so on, far more favourable conditions in Britain today to build a revolutionary party than in Egypt 10 years ago. Far less repressive, far more space to organise, far bigger struggles taking place. We have to begin the task today of building that revolutionary organisation. Not because we think the Revolutionary Party will, in and of itself, make the revolution, but because we know that without that party, our side can never win.
Yeah, that was very good. I just want to comment on... I've seen vampire movies where vampires deprived of blood turn into nastier vampires. And that might be a comment on the evolution of capitalism into fascism, perhaps. There are arguments against socialism. Commonly used are the people are selfish, human nature will make someone take power, and so on. And these are actually arguments against capitalism, a system that rewards selfishness and unethical behavior. And I want to maybe ask a question about rationalization. I don't know if anybody thinks about that, but there was this documentary, a study in Norway, where someone gets a free treatment they use bread dough, rubbing on people's bodies to cure them of different ailments. And the people getting the free treatment, contrary to paying for treatment, feel less effect of the treatment. Likewise, I believe this effect might be a part of the reason why people are critical to change, because they're actually paying through work and taxes for the continuation of the system. I just came from a meeting about mental health and Marxism, and the really uplifting essence I could draw from that was that the struggle against the system changes consciousness, like I said here, and empowers people. And this disintegrates piece by piece the machine of alienation, isolation, and despair that constitute capitalism, which I think we should build on. Thank you.
Feel a bit like filling a vacuum here, just one hand up. I just want to make a brief contribution why workers become revolutionaries. Just a bit of my own experience. I was a member of the old union TAS back in the 70s, and I first came across, as was the IS people then, started attending our branch meetings, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience. There was one character used to turn up with his female partner, and he used to shout slogans at us interminably while telling his girlfriend to shut up every time she started to say something. So, but anyway, I got out of engineering and went to Cornwall to lick my wounds, as you do, and then I came back into teaching, and joined the National Union of Teachers when Doug the Slug McAvoy was General Secretary. Do nothing, keep everybody quiet, repression everywhere. And then it was at that point that I decided to join the SWP. Mind you, going to a Tony Cliff Fringe meeting might have pushed me a bit. And that's how I became a revolutionary socialist. But the point I really want to make is, I'm not so sure about this argument we continually fall back on, that people don't become revolutionaries during downturns, because that's exactly what I did.
Hi, I'm Sarah from Manchester, and unfortunately I've not been involved in formation of any workers' councils in my workplace. But what I have been involved in, and I think it kind of shows what Joe was describing as the memory of the class, in the occupation of both Levenshulme Library and Levenshulme Baths in Manchester, where we actually saved the library and baths, which is absolutely wonderful. We didn't stop the other cuts in Manchester though, so it's not that great in lots of ways. But one of the first actions that we did was we occupied the library, and there was a whole range of people with all sorts of different ideas, occupied it, people with kids, etc. And a few socialists who kind of had ideas about the police. Now, a couple of hours into the occupation, the police came in, and they said, we want to speak to a couple of representatives. And they took the representatives off into a little room. We were going, don't go, and they went. And they came back and said, you have to leave. We have to leave, otherwise we're all going to get arrested. Now, fortunately, there were people around who just went, no, we don't. The police can come and talk to the rest of us. And so we made the police come and then try and negotiate with a whole group of us, about 50 people. And I didn't get quite so far that time, because we were just going, are you going to arrest us all? And they were going, And they were laughing at each other, and it became ridiculous when they were saying things like, oh, it's a health and safety risk towards children. And we said, well, we've got a fireman here, we've got teachers here, we've got social workers here, we've got parents here, what we're going to do. And actually, in the end, we did leave, but we left on our own terms. And we told them we were leaving on our own terms, which was fantastic. Now, a couple of weeks after that, we occupied the swing baths, and the police turned up again. And instead of going off into a room on their own, immediately people said, come on then, come and talk to the rest of us. Who are your leaders? Oh, we're all leaders here. And they learned the lessons from that very small bit of struggle. And, hopefully, we saved the baths. I said it wasn't in many ways it's a bit of a hollow victory because Manchester City Council has made some swinging cuts. We did win an argument about how they should set a no-cuts budget. We won that with a layer of people, but not with everybody, and certainly not with the entirety of Manchester. But I think it does begin to show how people's ideas can change and their attitudes to police and their attitudes towards their own power.
Yeah, Ralph Darlington, Manchester. I want to address myself to the question of the relationship between strike activity and political radicalisation. Because, there used to be an argument that Eric Hobsbawm put about the economism of industrial militancy. And many of the critics of the SWP argued that our emphasis on strike activity, on workers' power and so on, collective organisations, as the means by which society can be changed, the way in which ideas themselves can change, is misconstrued. And it's the argument that, workers may go on strike, but they're only concerned with their immediate issue of wages and conditions or whatever. They have no broader political aspirations. That's an old argument which is given. And I think, it's important to comment on this. I mean, of course, in periods of mass industrial activity, the late 60s, early 70s, clearly there was a huge political radicalisation inside that industrial militancy. And in periods of time, revolutionary conjectures like Germany in 1919 or Russia in 1917, clearly millions of people can be radicalised towards revolutionary politics. But it does beg the question, what about in more normal conditions, outside of an upturn? To what extent, when workers go on strike, are they radicalised? Are they drawn towards political ideas? And I think it's important for us to say, first of all, the context is inherently, potentially political. It doesn't mean that every strike is political. It doesn't mean that every worker necessarily draws political lessons from every strike. It depends on the context, how big the strike is, whether it's offensive or defensive, whether it's victorious or defeated, the intervention of reformist leaders as well as socialist activists inside the strike and so on. But potentially, the way in which the strike takes place raises political issues. Although the strike may be about an apparent immediate issue over wages or conditions, it necessarily raises all sorts of other questions, and particularly if government's involved, so for example in the public sector, where a strike on, say, on the railways or whatever, automatically raises questions about renationalisation towards privatisation. It has an inherent potential to at least raise those political questions. Secondly, I think it's important to put any strike in its broader social, economic, political context, in the sense that, we have been in a period of time where people are feel disaffected with the political setup, they feel disenchanted with the way, the sleaze of society in terms of big business and the banks and so on, and the way that politicians stuff their own pockets. And you see this in terms of a commitment to broad social aspirations and the willingness of large people to want to go on to demonstrate against the war in Iraq, over UK uncut and so on and so forth. And again, this can impact back in the workplace. There's no a sort of artificial separation between what goes on inside a workplace or with a strike or what takes place in the broader society. And third, I think very important, there's the role of activists, isn't there? Socialist activists who play a potentially crucial role. Strikes may begin spontaneously. They're not initiated by a socialist activist or an SPP member, but actually the outcome of the struggle, the lessons which are learned, the direction, the type of tactics which are adopted can often very much be affected by leadership, and particularly by socialist intervention. And in that sense, we can play a very, very important role. This is the part of socialist work and other publications, etc., to actually generalise from industrial struggle. So, it seems to me that industrial militancy can lead to political radicalisation. Not necessarily in every single circumstance, but it certainly holds that sort of potential.
This is kind of a question, I'm not sure how I'm going to form this. I was reading about Egypt, and one of the things that struck me is over the last few days you've had the protests, the pro-Morsi protests, and the news always says this is the Morsi bit of Cairo, this is Nasser City. And it sort of struck me that you've got this huge ferment and you've still got people who actually are a little bit behind, and it sort of kind of points out to me that whenever there is a struggle there is unevenness. You can't automatically say that everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. And if you look at that in terms of Egypt as well, I'm sure this will come out in other meetings and I'm not an expert on it, but the fact that the people who are not in the cities are out in growing the food in the fields and stuff, despite the fact that their interests would be very much with the revolution in Egypt because of the question of land and the question of who owns land and the landlords. They're still much more of a conservative element, much more supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and much more cautious. about where they go with it. And I think, and again, you could look at Iran, where out of the cities, then people are much more conservative, so it isn't an uneven process. But I think one of the things that was really inspiring for me was the article in Socialist Worker this week from the Egyptian socialists, who pointed out that they'd gone out to small towns, out of Cairo, and the work they were doing with people out there. If you haven't read it, read the article, because it's absolutely inspiring. And it made me think about the role of, as other people have said, about the role of revolutionaries, that the process is uneven, the process will happen, and all the rest of it, but what's crucial to it is how we react with it. Because we can have make a fundamental difference in what happens and how people go. And I think it's not just a question of having a paper or a publication or something where you can actually show people different arguments. It's being there all the time, just niggling away. And it doesn't matter whether you're out in a field in Upper Egypt or whether you're in a workplace somewhere in Britain, just asking those little questions all the time about what the rulers are doing, why is the boss doing that. Just putting doubts in people's mind can be a really, really important process in beginning to get people think about what they can do and how they go about it. And I just think that Joseph finished off with the idea that the comrades in Egypt have had a little bit of time to try and build an organisation, but that organisation is being really crucial where it matters in a time of great ferment. And although we're not in that position in terms of the ferment, we're certainly in a position we have, the possibility of actually building an organisation. So when things do erupt in Britain, we can be crucial in actually giving it that really important direction, which means we go that little bit further and say, it's not just a question of getting a big slice of the cake, it's getting the whole bakery.
Yeah, I was just really interested to hear what the last speaker said, and it sort of follows on, because I think for most of us, for most of the time, if we're honest, we are looking at individuals becoming revolutionaries. If you're in a workplace, and not so much at a college, you're talking relatively small amounts of people in terms of numbers becoming revolutionary. Often there's a game, isn't there? Why did so-and-so become revolutionary? Why not? And is it personal psychology and what happened in childhood and maybe look to revolution and so on and so forth. When you look at when the struggle rises, then you start to see something quite different start to happen. You start to see groups of people becoming extremely radicalised and looking to revolutionary outcomes. And in revolutions, you start to see masses move to that sort of politics. And when you look back at 1917 in Russia, and you read Trotsky's book on it, he talks about certain factories, be it a Bolshevik factory, a Menshevik factory, or a socialist revolutionary, which was the old sort of radical peasant organisation, factory. You're talking about, that 5,000 group of workers are with the Bolsheviks, those are with the Mensheviks. It's a completely different sort of position to be in, it seems to me. And I think when you look again at the German Revolution, you see the collapse of the main social democratic organisation, the SPD. They go from, roughly 1 million members to 300,000 in very, very short time. The whole way in which the politics of the German working class was absolutely dislocated. Other social political forces come into being. The USPD, a left reformist, centrist organisation, that gets massive amounts of members in very, very quick time. But an interesting thing, the SPD goes from 1 million to 300,000 and fairly quickly afterwards goes to 1 million. They recruit 700,000 people. They're not the old 700,000 people, they're peasants, people with the land, many troops coming back from the front, which for them is a shift to the left. These are people who would have been under the old Catholic organisations, depoliticised. That's a shift to the left, you have to relate to them. And therefore, in those processes, it's very interesting about the way in which revolutionaries have to look to the most advanced sections to organise, enabling them to relate to people who are behind the most advanced. And you can't cut yourself off from the mass of the population. So the last point is historical to go right down. I was very interested in what Joseph said about crisis of expectations in the here and now. How the clash between what you're expecting out of life and what's happening to you actually creates a crisis. And I tell you what I find, we had a big thing in the southwest over the health cartel. I won't put you the details of the hospitals. Do you know what the most militant section were? Midwives. The midwives were up the wall. You had meetings of midwives, of hundreds of midwives. Why? I think it's because most of the time midwives think, professional qualification, actually I'm going to do okay, not brilliant, but I'm going to do okay, life's going to be okay. And suddenly life isn't going to be okay. I'm a social worker. And you get the same dynamic I was told I'm going to be okay. This job was going to be for life, this was going to be good money, and suddenly everything's up for grabs. And now, sometimes you see sections of the working class move very, very quickly, which may not be the people that you thought were going to be the quickest to move, and become very, very radicalised.
Oh yeah, my name is Rory, I'm from Bristol SWP. One of the greatest pleasures I've had recently is doing the bedroom tax campaign, and I think it's quite interesting when Joseph talks about the changing in consciousness of people, and with that you've just seen people transform in front of you from meeting to meeting, and that's been a wonderful thing to watch. You know, really what the Labour Party does is you can do a comparison between what reformists and revolutionaries think. The Labour Party just called a demo in the middle of the city, people came out and then they went home and they didn't really engage with them. We decided to go onto the estates and build on the estates and basically meet the people and build local groups, self-activity. Now, one of the first women we met is a woman, Victoria, and at the first meeting she just wanted to talk about the bedroom tax. We didn't want to talk about anything like council housing or anything changes to benefit reforms, it was just the one issue. And literally after a few meetings, she tackling ideas, we met for a meeting and she said she wanted to go around with a petition and put "look after your own" at the top of it. And I thought, well, that sounds a bit, I need to talk to her a little bit more about this. And when I actually went through it with her, I was thinking, is this going down a racist direction? Actually, she said, it's a look after the class. She said, look after the working class. And it wasn't, and we teased it out, and we thought, well, maybe not use that statement and iron it out a little bit better. And through that was brilliant. Within a couple of weeks, she spoke at the People's Assembly in Bristol in front of 400 people. She has never spoken in public before in her life. She then was speaking at a demo in the middle of the city the next week in front of 250 people. That's twice in 1 week she publicly spoke. She never thought about it. Her son walked up to me and said, I've never seen my mum more confident. She's now come to a UAF meeting. She's engaging in other areas of politics. So you can see from just a little bit of self-activity where they take a little bit of control at one aspect of their life, they can move beyond what society tells us we're meant to be. And I think that's the important thing. And you saw that last night. I think the bedroom tax woman that spoke on the platform last night was the best one, because of the confidence of the struggle that she's involved in just made her just rock that room. So I'd like to say that that's what we are aiming to do just at a local level in Bristol. Thank you.
I wanted to come back on the comrade talks about the downturn, maybe contribution, about the SWP's idea that there was a downturn, and I think went on to say that because there's a downturn, nothing much is going to happen, you can't recruit people, which isn't quite what the SWP was trying to argue and what we were trying to argue out inside the party, as I remember anyway, back in the early 80s, late 70s, where we used to, once upon a time, have a perspective that we could build factory branches, but the revolutionary left in Italy had huge paper sales, they had radio stations, we had an upward curve of struggle in Europe and elsewhere in the world. It's possible to make an argument that actually, at some point, the class could be challenging for state power here if it carries on like this. So we had that kind of perspective at one stage in the 70s, but things changed. And actually, the Labour government and its social contract, which co-opted lots of the militants into serving the Labour government and holding back struggle, had an effect, had an impact, which might not have been apparent at the late 70s, but certainly by the early 80s it was apparent, and actually it created huge damage because the Tories had been going on the offensive. A bloke called Nicholas Ridley has something called the Ridley Plan, the Salami Plan. We understand the unions are strong in Britain, so it started with the weak ones, and then we'll finish off with the strong ones. Now, it's possible for socialists to make the argument with people about how we won in all of those disputes, but it wasn't the case that we went into them just because we have an idea that actually we're no longer all on the offensive together. Generally, it doesn't mean that we can't have fights and we can't win. It wasn't a fatalism. It wasn't about there's now a downturn, therefore we'll take a fatalistic attitude to all struggles and that they're all going to be doomed to fail. On the contrary, it meant that actually you have to put an argument, a very sharp, hard argument about how you win particular disputes, and that was most apparent, I think, in the miners' strike. But there are lots of other disputes, loads of disputes in the 80s, and some of them could have won and some, but quite a lot of them lost, but there were reasons for that, and actually, that whole question about the successive approximation, well, actually you can be a part of that argument, and actually, in the miners' strike, we did win miners to the SWP, a handful of miners compared to the hundreds of thousands in the industry, but nevertheless there are people that understood what happened, didn't, and actually after the strike they didn't all go and leave, some did drop out, what have you, but they still got that class politics and still understood actually, yes, we could have won if we'd done ABC, and ABC was solidarity, 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 essentially. It was quite possible for the miners to win if we'd brought in the dockers, if we'd brought in other groups of workers, which from time to time did actually come out, but were held back by union leaders. So there's an argument you could put there, as you put the argument, properly, I think, you could actually get people to understand actually this defeat wasn't inevitable. Yes, we did lose, but actually we'll be here to fight again. Let's remember the lessons on our side and why we did lose, and to go on to actually build for the future. So, yeah, it's not about fatalism, just about trying to understand the strategy and tactics of a period, and what was the best way to actually win, and what was the best approach that the SWP could have in that situation. Going on the street saying general strike, general strike, general strike, when people are losing battles, and you're not actually talking to anyone. There's groups that did do that, but actually making an argument, a concrete argument about how you win particular disputes, actually you can actually begin to draw people around you, even if you lose a dispute, who will actually learn those lessons for the future.
I must say, Joel, I enjoyed listening to you talk earlier on. It was brilliant to listen to. Anyway, as to why and how workers can become revolutionary is that workers on a daily basis are being robbed left, right and centre. It makes me angry when workers are being robbed at the same time. The bosses of all the water industry, the electricity industry and all the energy companies, again, six-figure salaries each year, and workers are being made to pay that price. Now, has anybody any idea how much of taxpayers' money was wasted on the drivel of the Royal Wedding, the drivel of the Royal Jubilee of recent years, the money that's spent on the Trident, and all the cutbacks that are going on? What we want is a full-scale workers' revolution, because at the end of the day, we do not want to pay the price, for this financial mess that none of us created in the first place. That's all. Thanks.
I'm a shop student in Glasgow, Glasgow City Unison. We've got a strike ballot in Scotland. It just started last week actually, so we've been having workplace meetings in Glasgow, and they've not always been easy actually, because they're quite polarised, the meetings. Some people are saying, and it's from a position of not having much confidence in the union leadership, because it was a big turnout on the 30th of November. But of course, and I know you've had your own difficulties down in England as well, but some people are saying, oh, what's the point? We're not going to get led properly. We're lucky we've got a job, some people are saying. And then you've got the absolute polar opposite of that, which is that people are absolutely sick to the back teeth of the way they're getting treated in their workplace. I work in social work, and people are just fed up, not only with their own wages and conditions, as somebody said earlier on, but also about the service they're able to provide to people as well. So to see people like the bedroom tax, the women from Glasgow talking about the bedroom tax, and also the carers in Glasgow that are fighting, can inspire workers. But I suppose in a sense it needs to be the workers out in order to grind the whole system to a halt, because the only means the production of the workers. So that is, I totally agree, and I think that's necessary. I think what we need to do when we go into these workplace meetings is we need to go from where people are at. So where people are saying, well, a 1% wage rise isn't too bad, maybe we should just take it, then we need to be armed as revolutionary socialists with the arguments to say, actually you've had just about a 20% pay cut in the last few years, so it's lies. And it's that kind of stuff, I suppose, that we can supply that can maybe help to change the climate in that room. So at the beginning of a meeting it was very difficult, polarised. Towards the end of the meeting, the people themselves in the room decided, we're fed up with the way we're being treated. The best way of combating this is to go and strike, and the majority of folk group came round to that way of thinking. And I think in this climate just now, and we have to do that with our union bureaucracy, the leaders of the bureaucracy, because it's the people at the bottom that will influence them and make sure that we're out together. And it's great to hear the NUT planning strike action. But I think as revolutionary socialists we have to probably be patient, but not too patient that we're not having the arguments constantly.
Hi, I'm Cam from Manchester. I just wanted to have a sort of comment on strikes and sort of radicalisation. My dad's a postal worker, as you might have heard that they're belted for strike and they're just waiting for a date, which is fantastic. I mean, I recently joined the SWP, and I wasn't really... The two things that we don't talk about in our house is football and politics. So when I sort of told my family that I've joined the SWP and started talking more about politics in my household, it kind of got with very negative feelings. But then after you talked, when I heard about all the disputes and happening over the closure of 70 postal depots, so privatisation and sort of destruction of the Royal Mail and things like that, I started talking to my dad about it, and he's in the trade union. 90% of those in the Royal Mail are in the CWU union, which is fantastic. It's like 164,000 people there. And so after a few weeks, he actually, I came home to find a load of CWU pamphlets on the table. I sort of thought, okay, that's interesting. What's this? And he said, you can get free legal advice if you part of the union. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that. It's like, and he sort of replied, well, I've been telling you this for years. No, not true at all. So after I'd found out about the strike and went home and started talking to him about it, he then goes into a full-blown sort of political sort of debate about how bureaucratic the unions are, etc. And it's sort of that little push to sort of being able to say, actually, your views are right. And I think what you find in with Royal Mail, they've been cutting down a lot of the permanent jobs, making a lot of part-timers working. So a lot of the part-timers are part of the union, but they're still not in that oppression, essentially, or exploitation. So I think even though there's the strike happening, as much as I would love to stand with my dad on a picket, the chances of that happening are still quite low. Radicalisation, I think, is definitely a process, and like a few comrades have said before, it does put that argument that get people, normal people, talking about politics and actually realising what they're already saying is very political.
It's going back to what you were saying about Gramsci, and I'm probably doing a massive faux pas here, but I think there's a distinct difference between an acceptance, working class community, an accepting of their circumstances, and saying that they don't think there's any means of changing it. Because I've lived under 30 years of neoliberalism now, and I don't know anybody I know, and I'm a working class person, I don't know anybody I know who's accepting of their circumstances. They've got a mixed consciousness in their head about how we fight, but there's not an acceptance. In fact, there's a total rejection and hatred. Maybe it's just circles I move in. I mean, I don't know. But I don't, whether it's my workplace, whether it's my kids' school, whether you know what I mean. There isn't an acceptance. So I don't know, because I haven't read that much Gramsci, but I think we have to go beyond and saying that the fertile ground for us is that people are already not accepting of their circumstances, and it's what we do about it when they move into struggle, how we pull them, how we will win them to a fact that we can actually transform the society we live in. It was a question about, what was Gramsci talking about?
I just wanted to ask you a question. When you said about the fact that we're lucky in the UK because we're less repressive, or we're less repressed, I was wondering about the cases of, say, there is the decline in legal aid. What's just happened with the PRISM, obviously GCHQ is monitoring us continually. The infiltration by the police into activism, insidious methods that they're using, and also the fact that I've heard Britain described as basically the butler, as if we say, we'll take it, we'll keep on taking it, and we'll take some more. And it's a bit, I'm worried that there's a situation where the analogy of the frog, where you put it in the cold water, and you heat up the water, it doesn't realise and it boils to death. And you think, well, if that's the situation here, what can we do about it? Because I don't think enough people realise what's happening.
So over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the people who spoke in the discussion. First of all, on the very last point, you see, I think what you're seeing in Britain is a ratcheting up of the level of repression by the state. I don't think that means we're moving to a fascist state, a police state. We're not at that point yet. but I think it reflects the extent to which the ruling class are quite nervous about what's going on. You see, when the crisis hit around 2007, 2008, there were quite a lot of statements coming out of the police that said things like, well, you're going to have austerity, but don't cut us too much because you're going to need us when everything kicks off in Britain. I think there has been a slight move, or quite a sharp move in some cases, towards repression, but we have to see that in proportion. We're not yet moving towards a police state. Doesn't mean, though, that we should be complacent in the sense that if the crisis was deep enough, would the ruling class hesitate to impose a dictatorship in Britain? Absolutely they wouldn't. Absolutely not. When Britain was in a very deep crisis in the 1970s, there were all kinds of loony elements in the ruling class who were plotting all kinds of things with secret armies, coups, military takeovers and so on. Now those never became the mainstream position of the ruling class, but if we think that the British ruling class are any more pleasant, respect democracy or play cricket any more than any of the ruling class in the rest of the world, we're kidding ourselves. They're just as repressive and awful, and we have to resist any encroachment on even the limited rights we have under capitalism in Britain today. Secondly, someone asked a very peculiar question about the treatment in Norway, I think it was, with bread dough on people's bodies, and I was a bit confused. But I think there was a serious point, which is that why would people think that the treatment is more effective if they pay for it? It comes from a very simple thing that Marx called the fetishism of commodities. The way in which relationships between human beings become relationships between things mediated by money through the market. And it means that commodities and money take on a mystical power. Actually, it's a real power in a sense. If you have more money, you can buy more stuff. But what it disguises is the real human relationships that underlie these things. And one of the things we're fighting for, of course, is a world in which we have real human relationships, not purely mediated by the market and by exchange. I mean, it's only a little thing, but one of the things that annoys me about buses today is that you go on a bus and you're encouraged to swipe your Oyster card or give the money without even talking to or making eye contact with the bus driver. And it's almost like they're just shocked if you say hello or something. That whole human relationship is completely distorted by the market relationship. Okay, what the hell was Gramsci talking about? You see, what Gramsci said was trying to explain in quite a complicated way a whole range of different ways in which people behave under capitalism. Now, do working class people accept capitalism? I think the point he's making is that the acceptance of capitalism is only a partial and grudging acceptance. And I think that's a very important point that Gramsci's making, because it shows things can change. When you talk about contradictions, why do we talk about contradictions so much? Because we're interested in how things change. And things are driven, whether it's in the sciences or whether it's in society, they're driven through the internal contradictions. And the contradictions in people's heads are tremendously important because they show that people's ideas can change for an experience of struggle and fighting back. It's important to recognise, of course, that some working class people do accept capitalism. 30% of the British working class historically voted for the Tories, which is a horrible reactionary political party. The great majority of working class people, I would say at the moment, feel, though, deep bitterness against the system. They feel that the system is not delivering for them. It could be better. What they don't have is a confidence that they can go out and make a revolution and overturn the capitalist system and transform it in that way. That's still some way off, but the contradictions are tremendously important. I think Gramsci is a useful person guiding us through that. Can we build a revolutionary party in a downturn? Or not just a downturn, but a period like the present, where it's not really an upturn or a downturn, but it's a period of quite low levels of worker struggles. I think we can build a revolutionary party in this kind of period. What I don't think you can do is, I don't think you can build a mass party in Britain in a period like this. I don't think you can recruit 1 million people to the SWP outside of a much, much higher level of sustained worker struggle. It's in sustained worker struggles that workers begin to be confident and their ideas begin to change in a mass way, and you can talk about building a mass party. Nonetheless, we can grow, we can recruit people, and indeed we have to recruit people. If you go into a period of mass struggles with 50 members, it's tremendously different from going into a mass struggle with 5,000 or 10,000 members. If you have 50 members, you'll be irrelevant to the mass struggles, and you won't benefit from it. If you go in with 5,000 or 10,000 people, you can hope to merge with 50,000 or 100,000. If you go into a revolutionary situation with 100,000 or 250,000 people, you've got a chance of winning in Britain. If you go in with 1,000 people or 50 people, going to be very, very difficult. We have to try and build in this period in terms of trying to relate to the struggles that open up. How do you build in a period like this? Well, I'll tell you how I joined the party. I went to my public library, read Lenin and Marx until I found out I agreed with them, and then looked around for a revolutionary party to join. That's quite an unusual experience. And I don't even think I'm a weird kid who just read Lenin and watched vampire movies, but really, that's not typical. You do it by relating to the struggles in the here and now. Even at a lower level of struggle, there are struggles taking place. We relate to them, we talk to working class people and try and win them on the basis of actually giving them answers to the questions they're asking, fighting alongside them, and showing that our ideas can help to inform their struggles and make sense of the world. We try and recruit people on that basis all the time. And it's not enough just to recruit people. We have to train ourselves in the struggle. We have to become a party of leaders. We have to win the trust of working class people. We have to test our ideas, and we have to learn about those historical ideas collectively through debate, discussion, and activity. That's what we have to do if we want to build a mass party. So let me just finish by saying, you know, part of the reason the discussion of Marxism this year is so serious is because the period we're in is one of intense complexity and intense danger, I think, for working class people and humanity as a whole. It's a very dangerous situation we live in. The stakes are incredibly, incredibly high. And all around us we see chaos, absolute chaos in society. There used to be, people used to ask the question, can the workers run society? The question today is, can the bosses run society? Absolute chaos around us, and the challenges are absolutely enormous. And in this situation, the question of building a mass revolutionary party is not a luxury, it's an absolute necessity. And I would say to people in this room, if you agree with what we're saying, you don't have to agree with every word, every sentence of what everyone says, but what you have to agree is that actually we can do better than capitalism, actually working class people can run society better, and actually we need an organisation if we're going to do it. If you like those ideas, you should join us and find out what we're actually like. Take part in activity with us, discuss the ideas, and be part of our organisation. If you don't like it, we're not going to leave a horse's head on your pillow and drop you in a river with concrete slippers or something, probably. Join us, find out if we're the real deal, and help us build a revolutionary party.